Morning, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me a great pleasure to be able to introduce Mr. Alan Liotta to you. He is the Deputy Director of the Defense Prisoner of War Missing Personnel Office, and he's here today to brief you on the latest joint recovery operations between the United States and North Korea, which have just concluded, resulting in the recovery of 4 sets of remains believed to be Americans. I will caution you that he is just in on the red eye, and should he pass out or something while he's standing here, do not panic. We'll take care of him. We'll feed him some coffee. But please, Alan.
Good morning. What I'd like to do is start off with a few prepared remarks, and then I'll be glad to take any questions that you might have. Right now, what I want to start off by noting that we are halfway through the events which we have planned with North Korea for 1997. And these are 2 of the 4 events have been completed, and both have gone extremely well. The first was the joint recovery effort, which ended last week in the successful recovery of 4 remains of American soldiers. That operation is the second joint operation which we've done with North Korea since an agreement was reached with them last year in 1996. The first, you'll recall, was done last year, also in July of 96, and resulted in the recovery of the remains of 1 U.S. soldier who was identified and returned to his home in Louisiana and buried there. We have 2 additional operations scheduled for later this year. The next one will begin when the team goes into North Korea on the 19th of August. The advance team arrives on the 19th, the main body on the 23rd. They will conduct an operation for 20 days, as did this first team. And then the 3rd operation will begin on the first week of October and end in the end of October. All of the operations are going to occur in the same general area. On the map, you can see an orange dot. This is Unsan County. It's in the northwestern part of North Korea, and it's an area where the United States 8th Cavalry fought some very vicious battles against Chinese Communist forces in the fall of 1950. The remains which we recovered last year were recovered from this general area, and the 3 operations this year involve battle locations with the 1st Battalion, the 2nd Battalion, and the 3rd Battalion. The operation we just completed involved units associated with the 1st Battalion, and those are the remains we recovered we believe are all associated with the 1st Battalion. The second operation is scheduled to cover areas involving fighting by the 2nd Battalion, and then not surprisingly the 3rd will be involving areas of the 3rd Battalion. In the general area, though, in this arc of where the 1st and 2nd and 3rd Battalions were, we believe our records indicate there were losses of about 350 American soldiers in that general battlefield area. And so we're hopeful that these 3 recovery efforts will lead to the recovery of many of those remains. The second event, which has just recently occurred, in fact will end tomorrow, is for the first time the North Koreans have allowed us to do joint archival research in their military war records. And we've had 5 persons, 4 from my office and 1 from the State Department, in North Korea for this past week, working in their military records and war museums in an effort to get additional archival information which can help lead to answers involving the United States unaccounted for. The reports from the team during this past week have been extremely optimistic and favorable. My understanding is that the North Koreans have shared a great amount of information with the team, including unit histories, anti-aircraft shoot-down logs, some personal war records. They're also working with the team to allow them, the museum has a considerable amount of wreckage, and they're allowing the team to go through the records to copy serial numbers down, which will help us in accounting efforts and determining individuals that may have been lost. And they also are working so that we can copy all identification tags, ID cards, and other things which might be there that involve U.S. forces. This is the first time we've done this kind of work with the North Koreans before, and it was a result of negotiations and agreement we reached with them this year in May. It's been interesting. The team's report to me has been that the North Koreans are leery, not in the sense of sharing the information, but more in the sense of what the United States is going to do with the information. Their particular concern is that we're going to use it for some political purpose to criticize them, and the team has spent a considerable amount of time educating the North Koreans on why we want archival information and how we would use it in our overall work in our analysis, and also showing how we use archival information which we collect from other parts of the world in losses associated there, or cross-referencing against other information which we have for losses located in other parts of the world. That concludes my brief statement. I'd be glad to take any questions. Yes?
Is this effort aimed specifically at just folks who were killed in action over there, or is it also aimed at folks who just went missing over there and could be part of the phenomenon of folks who are MIA and the whereabouts just unknown?
Right. We refer to this issue as having three major tent poles, and each of the tent poles are really of equal length. The first involves the reports of men who are unaccounted for and who were last known alive or possibly alive, still in communist hands. The second is involving individuals who we know perished but whose remains were never recovered. And the third involves archival research. Each of these is intertwined with the other. The archival research is the key because it can provide answers to either of the two. But the recovery work can provide answers because if we can get to an aircraft crash site where we don't know the fate of the men in that aircraft, but we can do a recovery at that site and we learn information, we can find out either that they perished in the crash or that they were able to get away from their aircraft, and that will lead us into new areas.
Does the archival research include records of any of the POW camps that the North Koreans ran?
We've asked to get the information. We've asked for those kinds of data. I have not seen all the teams' reports, and so I don't know specifically whether they saw those kinds of records. But it is a key focus for us and one that we're trying to get information to, yes.
What can you tell us about this recently declassified Air Force report? It fits in the category that you were talking about of people last known to be alive. Is that something that's an active lead that you're following up, or what can you tell us what you know about that particular incident?
I have not seen that specific report. As you heard, I just flew back in, but I did see the AP report, which discussed it and made mention of it. And what I'd like to do is put it in context that, as you know from last year when I met with you before and as we've testified in Congress, we have several reports like this, and there was an ongoing effort since the end of the war to try and account for some Americans, particularly some U.S. Air Force pilots, who we knew were alive in communist hands at one time, but whose fate was undetermined at the time of Operation Big and Little Switch. We're still trying to piece that puzzle together. The report that you reference is one of those pieces of the puzzle. And the key to the archival work is, in fact, collecting all of those kinds of reports and putting them together so that we can construct this puzzle to learn what happened to the individual men. In this kind of a report, one of the things to keep in mind that we're trying to do is the report, at least from what I read in the AP article, appeared to be a summary report, not actually the first-hand report that led the analysts to put that report together to reach their conclusions. One of the things which my analysts are doing right now is trying to reach back and find those specific first-hand reports that the analysts used to make their summary reports so that we can understand their logic and rationale as to why they thought some men may have been alive or why they thought some men may have survived their incidents. One of the things that we found is it's been a difficult task just finding the U.S. records on a lot of these issues, and we've had people out across the United States over the last year and a half canvassing U.S. military archives, presidential libraries, and other places in an effort to locate these records so that we can make the assessment. The other thing we have done is we've talked to many of the individuals who were responsible at the time for putting together these lists or these studies. And one of the things which we learned from them is that in many instances, they did not know for sure the fates of some of the men, and their operating guidance at the time was, if you don't know, or even if you think the man perished, put him on the list that's going to be turned over to the North Koreans and the Chinese, put the onus of responsibility on the communists to answer the question for us, and then we'll let it sort itself out later.
Is it possible or plausible that any of these men could still be alive, or is that just raise false hopes?
I don't want to speculate because it could raise false hopes, but I will tell you that the U.S. government's position is we treat each and every one of these reports seriously when we receive it. We investigate it, we follow up on it, we attempt to corroborate it, and we treat each one of them as though this might be the one that is in fact factual and true. Yes, in the back?
Did you find any significant change in North Koreans' willingness to help your American team to excavate and get back the record over there? Was there any improvement, or how did you explain it?
Yes, there was some improvement, and some things which we measure success oftentimes in small steps. And we saw several small steps that occurred in this operation. The first was the operation began under significantly reduced tensions compared to last year. Last year's operation began basically under gunpoint with our team escorted everywhere they went. It ended in a much more relaxed environment and a general sharing of information between the two teams, the North Korean team and the U.S. team. This operation began with the atmosphere where last operations ended. There was no tension. There was some exchanges of information on how we should go forward. There was a production of witnesses and bringing eyewitnesses forward who could lead us to grave sites or places where they believed Americans may have been buried. And so we were very pleased with that. The second big change that I would note is that we negotiated this year for an agreement that would allow us to have direct communication between the site and Pyongyang. And we asked for satellite communications, but the North Koreans were nervous about that, and they authorized us only to use HF radio. The problem was the team had difficulty communicating with the HF radio between the site and Pyongyang, and so they asked the North Koreans if they could move their antenna to a higher mountaintop to provide better line of sight to Pyongyang. And the North Koreans agreed and allowed that team to move their antenna. And that's a request they easily could have denied if they had wanted to. And the other sign that we saw that was positive on the joint recovery effort was we agreed this year that the North Koreans would provide standby helicopter support in the case of a medical evacuation. And we asked for an effort to test that helicopter support since we wanted to see for ourselves that it would be working so that we knew the team would be safe. And last year we asked for this and were not allowed to have helicopter support and not even allowed to talk to a medical corpsman who would fly on that helicopter. This year, we did receive helicopter support, and 2 of my officers were permitted to board a North Korean military helicopter and fly from Pyongyang to Unsan to the site and then back to the hospital in Pyongyang to evaluate the helicopter support. And so all of those are things which we saw as very positive signs and a show of good faith and cooperation. There's a question back there.
Did the archival research help you at all in finding the remains of the 4 servicemen that you just found?
No, because the archival research happened after the joint recovery ended, and what principally helped us there was the location of local witnesses, villagers, who know the stories and the lores of where Americans may be buried and could provide testimony to the team. Yes.
Any guess why talks will bog down in New York over shapes of table and schedules and agendas, yet this operation quietly just motors along pretty consistently? Why is that?
I really can't say anything about the other talks in New York since I'm not involved with those. I don't know anything about that. I can say in regards to our talks and our success that I believe that much of the success comes from the fact that we've been very careful to delineate this issue as a humanitarian issue, separate from any other issue, and one that's really a soldier-to-soldier issue. Soldiers understand the cost of war. Soldiers understand the sacrifices that they have to pay, whether they're North Korean soldiers or American soldiers or soldiers from anywhere else in the world. And I believe that the reason we've had the success and we've gotten them to cooperate with us and do this is because we've been able to maintain it at that level.
What representation have the North Koreans made to you as to why they have rejected U.S. Requests to interview any of I think there are 4 U.S. Servicemen who defected to the North and who still live up there somewhere?
That's correct.
What's your understanding of their motivation for saying no, and how strongly has the U.S. Pushed that request?
We've pushed very hard the request both through the State Department and the Defense Department. And during our May and June negotiations this year with the North Koreans, we made it a key element of the issue of live Americans and also the defectors that we wanted access to them to be able to interview them. What they have told us is basically that they've tabled it. It's something that they think can happen in the future, but not something that can happen at this time. They frequently try to tie it to the issue of what they call unconverted long-term prisoners, North Koreans who are still in South Korea. And the South Koreans are concerned, obviously, about some South Koreans who are in North Korea. And when that issue comes up, we respond to them that that's an issue that they need to talk directly with the South Koreans about. It's something that hopefully if the 4-party talks go well, they will have a mechanism to resolve that issue. But it's separate and distinct from our interest in talking to any Americans who are in North Korea.
What kind of information do you have about what kind of information those 4 individuals might have? I mean, in terms of your intelligence or what those folks might have seen in their X number of years up in North Korea, how much time they might have spent in POW camps before they defected.
We have limited information. What we do know is that there were 6 Americans who defected between the 1960s and the 1980s. 2 have died. There's 4 still living in North Korea. Our understanding is that they work in the government or for the military for some element, basically teaching Western ways and Western functions, although if they went in the 60s, how much that applies to the 1990s, I can't really say. But that's our understanding of what they do and what their role is there. And our understanding is that they are not restricted, but they may even have families and be generally assimilated as much as they could possibly be, I guess, into North Korea. Yes.
What sort of change did the team see in the general environment in terms of the reports of famine and that kind of thing between the latest trip and the previous one?
Well, it was difficult because not all the members of the team were the same because we used different people for them, so they don't have the same sort of perspective from before and after or before and later. And they did not report very much on that since that's not the focus of their mission. The reports came in primarily as status reports of what was happening with the mission. The limited information that I did see, however, during the information was that the further you got away from Pyongyang, the more the conditions deteriorated. Yes?
There's an article in the Far Eastern Economic Review that said that there are 8,100 soldiers missing after the Korean War. Can you confirm that? Is that accurate?
That's right. The U.S. government total right now is officially currently more than 8,100. I can't be more precise than that because one of the things which my office has been focused on is trying to, in fact, develop a specific count of how many men actually are unaccounted for from the Korean War. The U.S. government, since the end of the war, has maintained 3 separate lists. Not surprisingly, the numbers on those lists and the names on those lists did not match up. My office for the last year and a half now has put a full faith effort into consolidating those lists and comparing them and getting a final list. And my understanding is that by the end of this year, we should have that list finalized.
Do you know what region specifically?
That's throughout the entire Korean theater. So that's North Korea, now South Korea, as well as men who were lost on aircraft or ships that were coming into the theater or going out of the theater and something happened. That's the total theater losses. Yes?
Sorry if you've already gone over this, but could you give us a description of the site exactly, the breadth, miles, or how large an area it is that you're looking for these the 350 perhaps? And also, are you coming across any Chinese remains that you can tell immediately that they are? And if so, what happens to them if you do come across them?
The general area, as I said, there's 3 specific areas where we are right now. And in fact, the base camp which the team established for this operation will be the same base camp they used for the second operation. The 3 units were total span was about 3 kilometers, about 3.5 kilometers from the northernmost end to the southernmost end of the arc that I mentioned earlier. And so we're in a very relatively confined area as to where the team is looking there. With regard to movement about that largely depends on witnesses and what the witnesses tell us to do. Another sign, a question was asked earlier about flexibility. Another sign of flexibility was at one point during this mission, the team asked for and received permission to actually split in 2 and to have 2 smaller units working in 2 separate sites concurrently. That was not a previously agreed upon point, but one the North Koreans allowed us to do so the team could maximize its effort in country.
I mean, is it mountainous? Is it farmland?
No, it's generally flatland and farmland kind of area.
And that's where the battle.
And that's where the battle occurred in November of 1950, and it was the first, really the first large battle involving the Chinese as they came across the border and engaged U.S. forces. With regard to your other question of Chinese remains, we have not found any Chinese remains that I'm aware of. Should we come across other remains, including other Allied remains that we find, the difficulty, of course, will be when you immediately find a set of remains, it may not be notified that it's British or Canadian or Turkish or any of the other allies. But the anthropologists can make many determinations on the scene, and we are talking to their other allied nations as to how they would like remains, if we do come across them, recovered, and whether they would like to repatriate them. Yes?
Can you discuss the payment aspects of this? Are you sort of greasing the skids, all this, with cash when you're out there, so you're providing money to these people, and that's one reason why they're cooperating?
That's a good question, and no, we're not greasing the skids. The agreement which we reached with the North Koreans this year is for a set payment for the operation, and it's based upon our experience in last year's operation. The benefit of having gone to the country and done an operation there is we now know what it costs us to do an operation. We know the cost of the land which we use, the labor which we use, the fuel which we consume, all of those things. And the negotiations this year, the costs which we projected out were based on exactly what we would do compared to the operation last year. So the agreement this year called for each operation, we pay the North Koreans $100,000. 50% of it is paid before the operation begins, 50% of it is paid after the operation ends. And that's because we have to buy fuel and things for the equipment, the Jeeps and other equipment which we lease. And so we need to have some of it paid up front, and then and then afterwards squared, the bill is squared. But it's the same amount for each of the 3 operations for 1997.
Is it paid in cash, or how do you write a check out, and who do you give it to, and how do you know where that money goes?
Well, we actually tried to use electronic funds transfers, and the North Koreans aren't quite there yet with EFTs, but we're working there. But so right now it's paid to cash. It's paid in cash to the Korean People's Army at Panmunjom.
So you just take a big bag? And
Actually, $50,000. I've never seen $50,000 in cash, but I was told it's really not all that big of a stack of money when you put all $100 bills there. So.
But just to clarify, is it your contention that the North Koreans aren't making a profit on this, so basically you're reimbursing them for legitimate expenses?
They're not making a profit on this, and we're reimbursing them for the legitimate expenses which we can justify and that we know we're expending. There's a question in the back here.
Well, roughly how many people are on these teams?
We're restricted right now to 10-member teams that go into North Korea. There are 8 members that go to the site, 7 of whom are from the Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii, 1 of whom is from my office. And then there are 2 officers who remain in Pyongyang to provide facilitation of communications from the site back to Washington and Honolulu, and also to interface with any senior officials, either the Foreign Ministry or the Defense Ministry, to resolve problems the team may have.
You mentioned,
That's the reason we wanted to have HF radio communication from the site to Pyongyang so that we could then get direct. Last year we did not have that, and so we in Washington sat mainly, and in Honolulu, where Central Identification Laboratory is, sat mainly in the dark, not knowing the success or failure of what was happening with the team at the time because of limited communications.
you
Another
mentioned
question?
operations in other parts of the world. Can you amplify that?
Certainly. We currently have operations that go on every other month in Vietnam. And in the months we're not in Vietnam, we're in Southeast Asia. And to compare numbers for you, we average about 100 personnel per operation in Vietnam, 40 personnel per operation in Laos. We also do operations in Cambodia. And the team has recovered. We did an operation in China earlier this year. We'll do another one in China in October of this year. And they've also done operations in other parts of South Asia, Papua New Guinea, and places where we've had World War II losses.
Yes. Have you all come across any information regarding any potential transfers of American or Allied POWs from North Korean or Chinese hands to the Russians? And is that a goal of your archival research, to get your hands on anything that would corroborate those charges? Or
That is an area where we're investigating and looking into. It's a specific area of concern for the U.S.-Russia Joint Commission on POWs, which is a bilateral commission between the United States and Russia to investigate the charges that Americans may have been transferred from either the Vietnam, Korean, or Cold War theaters into the Soviet Union. They continue that investigation using Soviet archives as well as information we collect in Korean archives and other places to help resolve that answer.
have you come across any anecdotal information or archival information on that subject so far in your work in North Korea?
We've come across some archival information and also some witness testimony that we believe is compelling and should be followed up, but we have not found anything that would directly say, in fact, we have proof that this occurred.
What about IDing those you've found? Do you know how long that will take, or whether it's possible?
I believe it will be possible. The identification process can range from several months to almost a year. We're optimistic, however, based on the operation last year, where the identification was made in a very short period of time, about 60 days, that we will have a similar success here because of the information we had going into the site. And also, we did recover some unique items, a dental prosthesis, which I believe was a dental bridge, which will be unique to an individual. We did recover a set of dog tags and an identification card, which should also help us in the identification process. So we're optimistic that it will go well.
Can you release now the dog tags or any information on?
I cannot. I understand there was one name that was released, but as I said, I just got back, and so I haven't even seen that name yet.
Can you describe the site? Is it basically virgin and untouched since the battle, or do you get the sense it's been picked over by locals or villagers? Is the battle site essentially left untouched since the battle itself?
My understanding is that the battle site, it's been 40 years, so it's not exactly as it was during the battle, and farmers are there and living on it, but it is roughly, the terrain is roughly the same as what it was at the time of the conflict. And I can tell you that the sites, last year's site, and my understanding this year's as well, were considered to be pristine sites. That is, they were not sites which the North Koreans had gone and planted remains there so that we would find them. That is something that's easily distinguishable by the anthropologist. When he's on site, he can tell immediately if the soil's been disturbed in a way that evidence may have been planted for us to find. That was not the case last year nor this year.
What's it like working with the North Koreans just on a personal level?
My experience and my personal experience has been working with them both in Pyongyang and in negotiations here in the United States, is that we're constrained largely by a high degree of mistrust and lack of trust. We've been working in an effort at the very beginning to assure them of the humanitarian nature of this mission, why we were pursuing it, why it's important to the Department of Defense and the U.S. government and to the families and the Congress. I think we've gotten past that with them. I think they understand that significance, which is why we're moving forward. Last year, we were scheduled to do 2 operations. We only did 1 because the submarine incident occurred and we could not do the second operation. This year, we're scheduled to do 3, and it looks like we're on track to do those 3 operations. My expectation is that next year we'll be able to increase those operations. We'll also be able to increase the number of archival teams we put in country working there, and that we'll also begin to get some answers about the live prisoner issue.
What's the senior most level you dealt with in the North Korean government, military, or their foreign affairs bureaucracy?
The senior most level that I personally have dealt with has been a 2-star general in the North Korean military, the Korean People's Army. And on the foreign ministry side, the most senior level we dealt with is an ambassador level at just below the vice foreign minister level.
The chairman of the House and I believe Intelligence Committees in North Korea right now, did you report these findings to him and to other members of Congress already?
He did receive briefings before he left on his trip, yes. And the mission was still ongoing at the time when he departed. Yes.
Over a 20-day period, if you have 350 people unaccounted for in the area, what's your optimum amount that you could hope for to even begin to recover, given that the small number of people that you have in each team?
Well, the optimum amount we hope to recover is 350, but the reality is we don't really know for sure, and this is part of our learning curve in North Korea right now. Whether the 4 is a realistic amount of what we're going to find as we do these operations, and we're going to find that many of the sets of remains have just deteriorated over the 40 years that they've been there, or have been moved or lost because of other reasons, or whether in fact we just hit 4 this time, but the next operation may get 20 or 30, would purely be speculation. Our expectation is when we've completed these 3 operations in this general area and we review what we've done in our procedures, we will be in a much better position by the end of the year to then begin to assess just how many of the 8,100 we are going to be able to recover and identify.
You talked about the deteriorating situation as you move farther away from the North Korean capital that some of your team observed. Could you describe what you mean by that? Were people, you see starving people, you see hungry people, do people coming up to the team asking for money? What happened?
Yeah, I had very limited reporting from the team on that because that was not their objective, and all we had was a sentence or so that said that the further away you move from Pyongyang, the more the conditions deteriorated. I don't have any other details beyond that. In the back?
Could you give just a sort of an idea of, I'm not familiar with how your operation works. What do you actually do when you get to a site? Technologically, how do you do it?
It's done as like an archaeological dig. And the person that oversees the operation itself is the anthropologist. There's a senior military officer in command of the overall unit because the unit itself is basically military officers. But the anthropologist is the guy who's in charge that dictates the site. And what they typically will do is they first interview local witnesses to try and find, and they have our archival information. They go to where they believe is the best possible location for remains. And the anthropologist, also using his scientific expertise, can look for depressions in the ground that might be a burial area or other places that he believes remains may be recovered. They then grid the site, usually by 3x3 squares using rope. And then they dig each one of those squares separately, and then they sift the soil through large sifters, looking for remains. If they find remains, then they will dig out to where it looks like the remains stop. In this case, what they found was a pit where 4 bodies had been thrown into a pit and then covered with soil. So they would dig to where they found the soil disturbances to be from 40 years ago where the pit ended, and then they would dig down until they hit sterile soil at the bottom. It's a very scientific archaeological dig, much as you would see anywhere else in the world on a true archaeological expedition. And that's the expertise the Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii has. And as I said, they do these all over the world, and they're very good at what they do.
Good time for one more question. Do you use satellite imagery, commercial or otherwise, to look at these sites ahead of time?
We use all the resources available to us to help us assess where we need to be going, and also to corroborate any information which we have that can guide us in our search for the accounting.
Specifically, do you use satellite imagery, a commercial one, for example?
I don't know that we've used commercial satellite imagery, Landsat and things like that. I don't know that we've used that. The last point that I'd like to leave you with before I have to depart is one that I think is fairly significant and can often get lost, just as I think comment was made earlier that as we go about this seemingly quiet work as we do it. But that is between July of this year until October, the end of October this year, with the exception of about 21 days, we will have had a sustained U.S. military presence in North Korea conducting this archival research and joint recovery work and doing the hard work that needs to be done to help us account for American soldiers that still have not come home from the Korean War. Thank you very much.